Buoyancy. What is buoyancy? Buoyancy is an object's tendency to float. You can think of buoyancy as an object's floatiness. In scuba diving, we use the term buoyancy to describe not only an object's ability to float in the water, but its tendency to sink or to do neither. Scuba divers use the following buoyancy-related terms. Positive buoyancy means the object or person floats upwards in the water or remains floating on the surface. Negative buoyancy means the person or object sinks downwards in the water or remains on the bottom. Neutral buoyancy means the person neither sinks nor floats upwards but remains suspended in the water at a single depth. How does buoyancy work? When an object is submerged in the water, water is pushed aside to make space for the object. For example, if you drop your new iPhone in a full glass of water, not only will you have a serious communication problem, but you will have an accidental spill from the water that overflowed the glass. The amount of water pushed aside to make space for the iPhone is exactly the same volume as the iPhone itself. We say that this water has been displaced. When an object or diver displaces water, the water surrounding it has a tendency to try to fill in the space the object now occupies. The water pushes against the object, exerting force and pressure on it. This pressure pushes the object upwards, and this is called the buoyant force. How can you tell if an object will float or sink? A simple way to determine whether an object will float, sink, or do neither is to use the Archimedes principle, which explains that there are two forces at work to determine if an object will float or sink. Gravity and the weight of the object. Which are the two factors? Number one, gravity and the weight of the object, which pushes the object down. Number two, buoyancy or buoyant force, which pushes the object up. If the force from the weight of the object is greater than the force from buoyancy, the object sinks. If the buoyant force is greater than the force from the weight of the object floats. Now all that is left to figure out how much the buoyant force is for a given object. The simplest way to do this is to weigh the water that the object displaces. The buoyant force on a given object is the same as the weight of the water that it displaces. It therefore follows then that an object floats up if the weight of the water it displaces is more than its own weight. An object sinks if the weight of the water it displaces is less than its own weight. An object remains suspended if the weight of the water it displaces is exactly the same as its own weight. In diving, therefore, we want to sink at the beginning of the dive to get down to our desired depth and then remain neutrally buoyant until we ascend. We can't change from negative to neutral buoyancy on a whim because we can't change the amount of water our bodies displace. Therefore, divers control their buoyancy using an inflatable jacket or a buoyancy control device. Again, a buoyancy control device, BCD, to displace more water, either by inflating it and increasing their buoyancy, or less water by deflating it and decreasing their buoyancy. What factors affect a scuba diver's buoyancy? A diver's buoyancy is determined by a host of factors. Some of the factors affecting a diver's buoyancy are the buoyancy control device. Divers control the buoyancy underwater by inflating and deflating their BCDs. While the rest of the gear maintains a constant weight and volume, a BCD can be inflated or deflated to change the amount of water the diver displaces. Inflating a BCD causes the diver to displace additional water, increasing a diver's buoyancy, and deflating a buoyancy causes the diver to displace less water, decreasing the diver's buoyancy. Weights. In general, a diver and his gear, even with no air in his buoyancy control device BCD, are positively buoyant or become positively buoyant during a dive. For this reason, divers use lead weights to overcome their positive buoyancy. Weights enable a diver to descend at the beginning of the dive and stay down during the dive. Exposure protection. Any exposure protection, for example a wet suit or a dry suit, is positively buoyant. Wetsuits have tiny air bubbles sealed within the neoprene, and dry suits trap an insulating layer of air around the diver. The thicker the wetsuit or dry suit, the more buoyant a diver will be, and the more weight he will need. Other dive gear. The buoyancy of each piece of gear it contributes to the diver's overall buoyancy. All other things being equal, a diver using heavier regulators or fins will be more negatively buoyant and needs less weight than a diver using a lighter gear. For this reason, divers need to test their buoyancy to determine the proper amount of weight to use on a dive whenever they change any piece of dive gear, even their BCDs, fins or type of scuba tank. Tank pressure. The compressed air in a scuba tank has weight. The volume of the tank and the weight of the tank's metal remain the same during a dive, but the amount of air inside the tank does not. So, as a diver breathes from a scuba tank, he empties it of air and becomes progressively lighter. At the beginning of a dive, a standard aluminum 80 cubic foot tank is about 1.5 pounds negatively buoyant, while at the end of the dive, it is about 4 pounds positively buoyant. Divers need to weight themselves so that they can remain negatively or neutrally buoyant even at the end of the dive when the tank is lighter. Air in the lungs. Even the volume of air in scuba divers' lungs will have a small effect on his buoyancy. As the diver breathes out, he empties his lungs and his chest becomes slightly smaller. This decreases the amount of air he displaces and makes him negatively buoyant. As he inhales, his lungs inflate and he increases the amount of water he displaces, making him slightly positively buoyant. For this reason, scuba divers are taught to exhale on the surface to begin their descent. Exhaling helps a diver to sink. During the open water course, a diver learns to make small adjustments to his buoyancy using his lung volume with exercises such as the fin pivot. Salt versus fresh water. The salinity of water has a huge effect on a diver's buoyancy. Salt water weighs more than fresh water because it has salt dissolved in it. If the same diver is submerged in first salt and then fresh water, the weight of the salt water he displaces will be greater than the weight of the fresh water he displaces, even though the volume of the water is the same. Because the buoyant force on a diver is equal to the weight of the water he displaces, a diver will be much more buoyant in salt water than in fresh water. In fact, a diver in fresh water can use nearly half the weight he used in salt water and still be adequately weighted. Body composition. Fat floats. The higher a diver's ratio of fat to muscle, the more buoyant he will be. Women generally have a higher percentage of body fat than men and are therefore more buoyant and need more weight. This is the reason that bodybuilders sink in a pool while the average person can float. Step-by-step buoyancy for the average diver. How do we apply buoyancy concepts to an average dive? Here is a step-by-step guide on how to adjust your buoyancy on a typical scuba dive. Number 1. Inflate the buoyancy compensator and jump into the water. Before leaping off the deck, inflate the BCD so that you will float on the surface. This will allow you to deal with any last-minute problems before you descend, such as forgetting to open your tank valve or maladjusted mask. Number 2. Deflate the BCD just enough to descend. To begin your descent, deflate the BCD just enough so that you can descend by breathing out. The trick is to descend slowly enough to have time to equalize your ears. Completely deflating the BCD may cause you to sink like a rock and cause ear baritone. Number 3. Add small bursts of air to the BCD as you descend. As the diver descends, the water pressure around him increases. This causes the air in his BCD and his wetsuit to compress, and he becomes more negatively buoyant. Compensate for your increasing negative buoyancy by adding a small burst of air to your BCD whenever you feel that you are beginning to sink too quickly. Number 4. Add air to the BCD to achieve neutral buoyancy. Once you have arrived at your desired depth, add air to the BCD in small bursts until you are neutrally buoyant. Deflate the BCD as needed during the dive. Remember, as your scuba tank empties, it will become increasingly positively buoyant. It may be necessary to deflate the BCD in small increments to compensate for the increasing boil time. 6. Deflate the BCD as you ascend. This may sound counterintuitive, but remember that the air in your BCD and wetsuit will expand and make you more positively buoyant as you ascend. The goal is to control your buoyancy during ascent by remaining neutrally buoyant and swimming, not floating up. Number 7. Inflate your BCD on the surface. Once your head reaches the surface, go ahead and inflate your BCD so that you can float easily on the surface before removing your regulator. Now this sounds obvious, but many divers who are excited about the dive will forget to inflate and get a mouthful of water as a reward. The problem with too much weight. Divers with an excessive amount of weight will have a more difficult time controlling their buoyancy. The more weight a diver uses, the more air he will need to add to his BCD to compensate for the negative buoyancy from his weights. As the air in a diver's BCD expands and compresses with any small change in depth, the more air he has in his BCD and the greater volume of air that is expanding and compressing. This makes it more difficult for the diver to control his buoyancy as he changes depth. To avoid this problem, be sure to perform a test for proper weighting before diving. Now that you know the basics of buoyancy and how to apply it to your dives, have a great dive!